This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. For this episode, we're speaking to journalist Nilo Tabrizy. She's going to be speaking about the protests that erupted recently all across Iran. Now, they started when the government put the fuel prices up massively, but that wasn't really why everybody was so angry and why they were protesting. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Over 200 people have been killed and the protests so far have been crushed. The internet was cut off for 10 days as well. So Nilo is going to explain to us what happened in that time and tell us what she's seen since the internet came back on and a lot of evidence came flooding out to journalists. Please do consider supporting us on the Patreon for bonus episodes at patreon.com/popularfront. All right, so I guess maybe let's go back to the start. How did these protests kind of break out across Iran? I know it's not spontaneous as some people think, and it's because of the fuel thing. I know it's been mounting, but what was the straw that, broke the camel's back, I guess?
It really was the fuel announcement, and it was because the government announced it so abruptly. So on midnight on Friday, so after a Thursday parliament session, after most Iranians had gone to bed, Rouhani's government announced an abrupt decision to cut fuel subsidies. And what it was supposed to do was to increase cash handouts to the poor. But this move also just sent gasoline prices skyrocketing by 50%. And so this protest really was a response from poorer Iranians who've already been impacted by inflation and shrinking budgets for the past year. And the government stood firm behind its move. It said, we're trying to go from fuel subsidies to cash handouts. The supreme leader stood firm behind this move, but people were incensed. And so within 72 hours of the announcement, Iranians spilled into the streets in cities across the country, towns across the country. They did things like, shutting down major highways in places in the south of Iran, for example, that are like important port towns or important petrochemical producing areas. And then the protest shifted. So it went from being about fuel, and then you could see some videos coming out of the country where people were calling for, an end to the Islamic Republic, chanting death to Khamenei in different demonstrations across the country. So that's really what sparked it. And the protests went strong for a few days, and then the government response was quite swift.
Yeah, well, maybe you can explain how big the protests were. I saw that within 24 hours, it felt as if they'd spread across the country. I mean, is that accurate?
That's accurate. And again, it's really hard to verify independent information from Iran about these protests for two reasons. One, because there was an internet blackout. So as soon as people started pouring onto the streets about a couple days after the fuel announcement, the government imposed a near blackout of the internet. So my family group chat went silent. I couldn't reach many sources. So you have that. And then on the other side, you have a lot of politically motivated dissident groups that were pushing their own information because they want to take credit for the protests and call for an end to the regime. So you have this kind of thing happening on both sides, making it really hard for us to know exactly the size or the number of casualties. But yeah, it spread across the country. It was in, the country's south and in Arab minority areas. It was in Shiraz, Esfahan, Tehran, in the north. It was really nationwide.
Right, and what was the response from the regime?
So, based on what we're seeing right now, it was pretty swift. It was quite violent, and so there were right now. I think Amnesty International is saying the death toll is about 208. So it was a pretty violent crackdown on the regime's part. And again, it's hard to verify these casualty numbers, but that's a lot. I mean, if we're thinking about it in context, in the 2009 protests in Tehran about Ahmadinejad's re-election, I think it was something like 70 or so people were killed in a span of 10, 11 months. So 208 people being killed in a few days of unrest is a huge number. And this is what right now people are characterizing as the deadliest protests in the Islamic Republic's 40-year history.
Wow, okay, I didn't know that. And how are they killing them? Just like live fire or what?
Yes, so we're getting reports of live fire. In some videos that we've seen, you're seeing kind of snipers on roofs. And again, it's really hard to verify this video, and we can get into that, but it is live fire. That's what we're hearing.
Right, yeah, maybe you can talk about that, like your job is quite difficult right now. Like you say, you're having to verify things. I think the internet was shut down as well, right? Like how are you working out what's real and what isn't?
So a little bit about the internet blackout. So again, within a couple days, the government imposed a near total internet blackout. This is not uncommon. The internet has been shut down for periods during unrest. This internet blackout lasted 10 days. So it was quite frankly suffocating. And so I was trying really hard to get in touch with sources. No one was talking. None of my normal sources were talking because everyone was really terrified because this was just such a swift and brutal crackdown. So that was happening. And then as well, this blackout lasted for 10 days this time around, which is, again, unusual in this kind of in the context of protests in the Islamic Republic. So that was happening. And then when I'm looking for footage, so I work on the video side, I'm looking for footage to document what's going on. A lot of it is being pushed out by these, opposition groups that are fashioning themselves to be the alternative for the Islamic Republic, trying to take credit for the protests and trying to go about regime change. So a lot of footage is coming out, being pushed out by MEK channels. So that's Mujahideen Khalq. They're that fringe dissident cult that was one of the first groups listed on the US's FTO list, Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And so they are in Washington circles. They lobby the government. John Bolton used to go to their annual conferences before he became National Security Advisor. He took $60,000 from them. Giuliani still goes to their conferences, went to one this year. So they're very much trying to be in the establishment and fashioning themselves to be the opposition. So a lot of footage is coming out from them. And obviously we have to verify everything. And these groups do have a history of pushing out old footage and saying this is of this current protest. So they do have a history of kind of reporting that this footage is relevant. So we just have to be very careful with verification, extra careful when it comes to Iran because of these politically motivated dissident groups. And then you also have stuff coming out from monarchist channels. So that's like another thing to look for. And then there's also footage coming out from folks who are US based that are calling for regime change, like Iranian Americans who have now kind of become a part of the Washington establishment. So there's just like a lot of checks we have to do, and it makes it super challenging to figure out exactly what's going on.
Right, you said about MEK there. I vaguely know about them and their strange little compound in Albania. But you said they're like a cult. Like, how do you mean?
So they are, a lot of experts call them a cult because they do things like forced divorces. You have to take vows of celibacy. If you have sexual thoughts, you have to write them down in this diary and perhaps present them. All these stories come out of how this group functions in their compound. And, that's kind of the character of their group. The State Department called them a cult. And the only reason they were, taken off the FTO list, so I spoke to the ambassador who worked at State at the time for a previous story during the time that MEK was delisted under Hillary Clinton. And he said, we didn't delist them because their activities had changed. They were still doing things that we would define as terror or cult-like, but we delisted them because after the Iran-Iraq war, where they were, fighting on Saddam's side against Iranians, they kind of went to this compound there called Camp Ashraf. And after Saddam was toppled, they were kind of seen as these vestiges of the Saddam regime. So you had the new Iraqi government kind of trying to attack them, and the U.S. said, well, if we don't do something with this group, it's going to be blood on our hands because they're in this situation because of the U.S. invasion. So they had to delist them in order to put them somewhere. And Albania was the only place that would take them.
That is insane. It's very Hillary, isn't it?
It's super interesting. They're a super interesting group. I mean, John Bolton took $60,000 from them, which he disclosed when he was becoming NSA months before he became the National Security Advisor. He was speaking at their conference and said, we will celebrate next year in Tehran. So they're a very interesting group. They definitely are cult-like. There's a lot of reports of people trying to leave and not being able to. They really lobby hard in Washington. They have very interesting relationships with both Democrats and Republicans. And even Canada's former prime minister, it's very interesting who they have, because if you don't know the history of their group, what they're saying doesn't sound crazy, right? What they're saying is down with the mullahs, we're the democratic alternative. But then when you go and see, oh, well, during the 70s, they killed, at least 6 Americans and tried to bomb American companies in Iran, it starts to add up once you look at the history.
Right. And what about, you mentioned the monarchists. I'm not familiar with that. Who are they?
Yeah, so monarchists are just kind of like a loose group that want to bring back the glory of Iran's monarchy. So they fashion themselves behind the last king, the last Pahlavi king's son, who lives in D.C. right now. His son makes regular appearances on, I think BBC Persia, Iran International, sometimes even BBC, saying that I want to take credit for this country. I want to be there, this kind of thing. Those groups prop him up. They kind of, I think it's almost nostalgia in a sense, or their real belief, who really, it's hard to tell. But yeah, so they want to return to the monarchy.
Right, so are there any groups then, other than fucking Bolton with his war hard on, or these weird monarchists, are there any groups that are genuinely no, we do want a democratic Iran? Because I know the protesters are saying, down with the dictator, but is there anyone that can really step in their place without it being some weird, CIA coup thing?
At this point, it doesn't look like there is a democratic an organized opposition. And I have friends ask me about this all the time. Why isn't there an opposition? And it's because, the revolution was super scarring, and that's a fresh memory. That's 40 years ago. And so a lot of the diaspora is fractured. A lot of the diaspora hates each other, points to different groups for, you're the reason why we have this government, or actually we like this government. So it's a really fractured diaspora, and it hasn't come together in a way to provide some kind of alternative that isn't the MEK or isn't monarchists or isn't just this loose just regime change call.
Right, that's a shame. And in terms of the protests, I saw some footage of, I think in the Kurdish area specifically, in Kermanshah, they were fighting back. Did you see much of that? Protesters trying to confront the security forces.
I did see protesters trying to confront security forces, or, I think just even hearing the chants, death to Khamenei on the streets is really bold. And just kind of hearing that kind of opposition has been really interesting. And it's not just protesters. We've had members of parliament in Iran that are starting to say really interesting things. And again, keep in mind, there's a parliamentary election coming in February. So whether or not they're playing to that, who knows? But there was this MP named Parvaneh Salashuri in Tehran that this week stood up in parliament and said the Islamic Republic is now a dictatorship in every sector of power, a complete and raging dictatorship.
You said that in Iran?
She said that in Iran. She's a reformist politician. She represents Tehran. And it's really interesting.
How dangerous is that for her to say? I didn't realize that. Well, I just thought you just can't say that. You'll go jail like Turkey or something. How dangerous is that for her?
It honestly depends. With Iran, what's interesting is you don't really know when you've crossed the line sometimes and when you might get in trouble for saying something. So you have to think about the Iranian government's calculus. Are they going to go after a government MP who's on the record saying things in parliament that is her opinion and respecting and kind of representing her voters? I don't know, because there's so much international attention and they're not going to say that. Are they instead going to go after journalists? Are they instead going to go after protesters? Because Iranian society is a little bit more open than we think, but we don't know where the line is when it comes to how the government's going to respond when people test that. But I talked to journalists, some of my friends who are reporters in the country, and they say things like, we can't report, we can't do anything. And there's some Iranians who are Iranian journalists who've tweeted about, I'm trying to file this story, my editor's not taking it, I can't talk about what happened in X city. So there's suppression happening for reporters for sure, but it's been interesting to see how members of parliament are kind of standing up.
Right. And what was the Iranian response? Obviously, they would have said something about the protests on TV. I imagine it was, completely partisan to the government. But what did they say about the protesters?
It's interesting. I've been watching a little bit of Iranian state TV to see what the response has been, and it's kind of shifted. They've started, in one instance, they said, they looked at one town where there was a lot of unrest, and they said, everything's fine here. And then they put out another news package that started with this music, that was this dark, spooky music, and they were showing pictures of the protests, and they're showing like BBC Persia's news packages, Iran International's news packages, these international media reporting on Iran. And they're saying like, this is what they're saying is happening, but we're bringing you the real story. And then they say that, people who are protesting here, they're external groups, they're terrorists, they're not even of the local population. And so that's a line sometimes they've gone with. Other times they're saying like, you're destroying property, but it's interesting to see how they've been crafting their message. And I suspect what the U.S. has been saying about the protests is going to be pretty damaging for Iranian protesters as well.
In what way?
So Trump has come out to say like, we support and stand by protesters. Brian Hook last week gave a press conference about Iran. And he said, people were asking him about the internet blackout. And he said, shortly after I came into this role, we worked to get tools into the hands of Iranian people that would allow them to communicate with each other, and despite of regime efforts to shut that down. That's obviously super damaging because Iran likes to, that's kind of their thing is, these protests are being caused by outside forces. So when you have the U.S. saying, hey, we're giving them tools to communicate, that helps the Iranian government in their case to discredit genuine protesters. And it makes it really dangerous for genuine protesters.
Right. Yeah, that really adds to that kind of, you get these normally like white anti-imperialist types are like, it's a regime, it's a CIA coup. But when they're coming out like that, it really doesn't help.
No, it hurts them. It's pretty dangerous. So you have that. And then you have also on the U.S. side, they're not being super clear on their methodology, where they're getting their numbers for protests. So, Brian Hook said, up to 1,000 people in Iran could have been killed in these protests. And that's a pretty big number. And so again, it's hard to verify, but the U.S. is pushing out like the top of the top number. So you kind of have this interesting thing playing where both Iran and the U.S. are looking at these protests and trying to craft a story or push a certain part of the story. Where still, as of 10 days ago, the death toll by Amnesty International, which is what a lot of people are relying on, is at 208. That again, that's hard to verify too, but yeah.
Right. Like we said at the start, the fuel tax was the straw that broke the back, as it were. But maybe you can explain a little bit about the background behind that as well. I understand there's been unrest for quite a while. I think this is like the second protest this year. I mean, not as big, but, what's been going on in Iran?
Being in Iran right now, if you are a poorer Iranian or they're really if you're a part of the shrinking middle class, it's been extremely difficult. I mean, since the U.S. has put its kind of what it calls its maximum pressure campaign, which the U.S. says, hey, if we sanction Iran enough and we cripple them enough, like maybe they'll come and talk. And Iranians don't see it that way, obviously. And so they've made it impossible to do any business with Iran. They've virtually halted all of Iran's oil exports, and they've made it extremely difficult to get medicine into Iran, actually, which has been what they say, medicine is a humanitarian good, we allow it in. But I did a story where I talked to pharmaceutical importers, where I talked to folks who have chronic diseases, and people haven't been able to find the medicine they need. And you can't just produce, if you have MS and you've been on this treatment for a while, you can't just all of a sudden become a domestic producer and change your drugs. That does not work. There's been a huge number of folks who haven't been able to get chemo treatment in Iran. So I know stories of people covertly bringing in chemo drugs that you're not supposed to, but what else are you supposed to do? I've heard stories of people getting anesthesia that's kind of black market anesthesia, that they wake up from their surgery and they're off, or they don't wake up from their surgery. And, and not having medicine being readily available only emboldens the black market there, right? So you've just had this immense pressure on Iran. People, just inflation has been crazy. Any kind of purchasing power you've had is down. The price of meat is super expensive. I think I read somewhere that it's something like 10 euros a pound or something crazy like that. Like, it's just, things get more expensive every day. And, you go on there's this website, it's called Divar, which is like Craigslist. And you go on it and you see what Iranians are selling. And you can see they're saying, I'm selling this for muhajirat, for immigration. People are selling family grave plots so they can try to leave the country because the money they had in the bank 6 months, even a month ago is just like the value is plummeting to a point they can't do anything and leave with it. So they're trying to sell everything they can. That's the case for a lot of people. So it's just this immense pressure on people, especially young Iranians. I've spoke to journalists who said, I can't work. I've been able to work in the past year. I'm unemployed. I have like this kind of education. I was educated in the US. I can't do anything. I'm stuck in this limbo. So there's been a lot of pressure for Iranians. And so while this fuel tax sparked it, we know in these protests, it's been about something bigger. So it's been extremely difficult with U.S. pressure on Iran's economy. That, it's obviously there's issues of corruption in the Iranian economy, but the sanctions have been absolutely crippling.
Well, yeah, I was just about to ask that. How much of that is because of the sanctions and how much is just, the regime just fucking about, basically not doing things right?
I've been talking to, experts who look at Iran's economy and are, people that I interview for stories about sanctions. And they do say overwhelmingly it's been on the U.S., how the U.S. has chosen to apply its sanctions regime. Because there's a couple ways you could do sanctions, right? You can look at the case of Venezuela, where the U.S. says, okay, we're going to sanction this, and this top person. Cool. These are the bad actors. We don't want to sanction the people. So you can do that. But with Iran, they're sanctioning everything. They're sanctioning its central bank. They're doing secondary sanctions, saying, hey, Netherlands, if you want to import drugs with Iran, like, how are you going to do these banking transactions with Iran, because we're sanctioning every way that you transact with Iran's banks. Like, they're sanctioning every level of it. And it's been an immense amount of pressure on people.
So, I mean, I don't want to speculate too much, but to me, that sounds like it's America's way of trying to force some kind of regime change or protest without actually getting their hands dirty. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, we've asked, in the past, I've asked the government, the U.S. government, what they think. Oh, are you pushing for regime change? Are you doing this? And they come on the record and they say no. And they repeat, for the record, they do say this, our policy is not regime change. Again, their policy is we want to cripple Iran, put maximum pressure to bring them to the bargaining table. And Iranians see this as super disingenuous. They say, we already made a deal with you. And like under the tenets that you couldn't even stick to the original deal. In what world do we trust you to actually work with us? And it's also a point of pride for them. Like we're not going to cower to the U.S. And the U.S. is doing this. They're not doing this with the public support of other countries. Like this has been the U.S. pushing sanctions. Europe is still somewhat trying to work with Iran in the framework of the nuclear deal. But it's really the U.S. that's been pushing these sanctions on Iran.
Right. Well, then with that in mind, how come the protesters are all shouting death to Khomeini, like death to the dictator? Because there's a lot of videos where they're doing that. It's not some kind of made up thing in the media. You would have thought if it was so much on America with the sanctions that they'd be more angry with America. But certainly I did see quite a few things this time around where, people were like blaming him more than anyone.
Right. I mean, they're blaming him. It's not just him. Again, it's this member of parliament in Iran's government who also is called the Islamic Republic a dictatorship. They're blaming the supreme leader because he comes out and, Rouhani couldn't pass this fuel move, this subsidies move, without the support of the council and without the support of the supreme leader, right? So at the end of the day, Iranians know that the supreme leader is if he supports it, it's happening. So because he came out and supported what the government did, and people kind of hold him to account for some of the violence they've seen on the government's part, that it's natural that they would be blaming that, because it's like people on the streets aren't going to sit there and wave their finger at the sanctions regime from the U.S. They're going to wave their finger at people who are being killed at the hands of police forces and, the IRGC or, different units. So that kind of makes sense.
How powerful is he, the supreme leader? What is it like? What's his role exactly?
He is the guardian of the revolution. I mean, what he says still goes. I mean, you can't really do anything without the support of the supreme leader in Iran politically.
So he is still that powerful?
Yes. And I think people have been wondering for a long time, like what's going to happen with the next supreme leader? Who's it going to be? What kind of supreme leader is it going to be? Is it going to be someone who's still conservative and close to the West as he is? So that's also a question. But I mean, he's, for now and for the foreseeable future, he's still going to be leading the country in that way.
So they've basically said, yeah, the protests are over. Is that true? Like, are they over? Have they been crushed? What's happening?
From what I'm hearing, they have definitely petered out. It was a really strong period of a few days protests and protests happening after, but there was pretty swift response by the state. So the actual in the streets is kind of back to normal, but people are still really pissed off by what happened. So I don't know what's going to happen next. It's a lot of, I mean, you think about it, if you put yourself in their shoes, like this is a lot of pressure they've faced. I'm sure it'd be really terrifying after you see 200, reported 200 people being killed. Like, what does that do to your appetite to protest again? I'm not sure what's next for Iranians who are really dissatisfied with the government.
What about the prospect of like militant groups? There was an attack, I think this year or maybe last year, I think some kind of separatists. How possible is that in Iran, do you think?
Iran is actually pretty safe compared to its neighbors. It's pretty stable. So when you have these attacks, it's kind of it's definitely unusual. The security apparatus in Iran is pretty strong. So it's helpful for situations like this, for keeping security and keeping these groups out of there. But I mean, we'll see. These groups have always kind of existed, especially like in border regions. They've kind of existed. So we'll see. I don't know. I'm kind of unsure what the future looks like for separatist groups and for attacks inside Iran. But yeah, that's definitely the fear of that is something that the government really speaks to in terms of like, we need security, we need stability. And for a lot of Iranians, despite how terrible this, they might find the government, for them security is a main thing. They don't want to become Syria, they don't want to become Iraq. So until there's some kind of alternative, which who knows, like security is really important to Iranians who live in the country.
Yeah, of course. Okay, Nilo, is there anything else you think we should cover before we wrap this up?
I think we've covered it on this one. It's been really hard to figure out anything what's going on in the story because local media can't report. It's hard for us to report from here, from outside of the country. So it's been a challenging one. But yeah, I think that's mostly it.
If people want to, follow your work and get in touch with you, how can they do that?
You can follow me on Twitter at ntabrizy. And that's mostly where I live and breathe, is on Twitter.
Right. Do you want to spell that as well?
Yes. It's N, T as in Tango, A, B as in Bravo, R, I, Z as in Zulu, Y.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jake.
That was Nilo Tabrizy speaking about the brutal crackdown on the Iran protesters. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, keeping everybody informed about, the niche details of modern war and underreported conflicts, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. Go to patreon.com/popularfront for bonus episodes, narrated articles, all sorts of bonus content. You get all of our video stuff before anybody else. You can get access to the Discord, which is turning into this massive hub of research. Yeah, I think, there's definitely value for money there, and it supports us and helps us keep going without any proper corporate backing, because this is all 100% grassroots independent. Another way to support us and look cool in the process is buy our merchandise, and it's not any tit-for-tat bollocks like Teespring or any of that shite. It's proper. We have a champion windbreaker jacket right now, the away day, t-shirts, hoodies, all good quality, all sorts of stuff at www.popularfront.shop. Go there, everything is fairly priced, ships worldwide. Yeah, it's all good stuff. Please do remember to subscribe and hit the bell on YouTube. We do documentaries as well. YouTube.com/popularfront. The second part of our Hong Kong protest documentary is now up on the YouTube, so go and watch that there. The third part will be out in about a week, maybe more, but that will be the third and final part. Again, sorry it took so long to get all that out, but it's kind of just me really doing this. So in future I will definitely be hiring a editor. I can edit, it's alright, but it just takes me too long with everything else. Also follow us on the instagram.com/popular.front, or follow the backup Instagram.com/popularfront.co. We have a backup because we keep getting banned. We got banned 3 times in the last 2 months, and last week we got banned twice in 1 week. Every time Instagram comes back and says, oh, sorry, you were deleted by mistake. There's no safeguard really to stop it, because we've applied for verification and they deny it. They say you don't have enough followers. We have nearly 30,000 followers on the Instagram, and there are many accounts with less than 1,000 followers that are verified. So, it's bullshit. Basically, you have to have a kind of corporate media backing you to get the verification, or play ball and be like an influencer and put pop culture shit out there. They don't really want to verify, grassroots independent conflict journalism that's kind of taking the piss out of mainstream media quite a lot. It's understandable in a way, I guess. Like zombie scum of like Zuckerberg, you can understand why he runs his business that way, but whatever. But yeah, Instagram.com/popular.front. We put stuff on there that you just won't see anywhere else, just like all random shit, like updates with news, all the merchandise designs go up there. Yeah, it's a good community on there as well. Like, we actually have probably the worst comment section on the whole of Instagram, but it is at the same time it's kind of a like good community on there. It's hard to explain. Also, this episode was sponsored by the defensepost.com, defense with an S. Check them out. Been sponsoring us from the start. They do articles regularly about the world in conflict. Definitely check them out. Really good team. Thank you to the following Patreons for making all of this possible. They are Adam Bergsnyder, Axel Iverson, Azad, Brian McLaughlin, Chad Walker, Christopher Martin, Craig Miller, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Diana Gorvanek, Eloise Larson, Emiliano, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Frank Austin, Jack Mayhoff, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Josh, Juan Hernandez, Kay Hardy Roberts, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Lika Madik, Moody Al Rashid, Noah, Ari from the Discord, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from What Bitcoin Did, Q-Ball, Russia Al-Akidi, Rohan Abare, Rubicon, Ryan Sandercock, S. If you want, a name, please do put it on there. Otherwise, S is fine. Scartoon Music, Sebastian from the Discord, Sentry, Surushe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, STV, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost, and Zachary Hinch. Thank you very much. The Patreon's doing well now. It's at the point where I can do mostly, I'd say 90% full time on Popular Front, which is just brilliant. You know what I mean? It's really, in 2 years nearly, we've got to this point. So I think that's excellent. Thank you very much to everybody supporting. The more we make on the Patreon, the more Popular Front there will be for everybody. Obviously, I have a lot more time to do this now that the Patreon's doing well. So yeah, thank you very much. Please do send it about, spread it. Patreon.com/popularfront. If you don't want to, sign up monthly, there are one-time donations. Popularfront.co/support. You'll see it all there. Bitcoin, one-off things to the PayPal. And again, the merch. Popularfront.shop. Music in this episode. The intro was by Home, and the outro was by my mate Sam Black, also known as Son of Old. His SoundCloud is soundcloud.com/son-of-old